Few thoughts today around the broad theme of forgiveness and forgiving, reconciliation, and truth. There is a good collection of humor literature around forgiveness. There's one story that comes to mind about the preacher really giving it to his congregation, a full sermon, long one with quite substantive content about forgiveness. And he noticed throughout the sermon that at the back of the church, the oldest member of the church was sitting there, a 96-year-old male, smiling all the way and seemingly enjoying the sermon. So after the sermon, he asked him, did you enjoy the sermon? And the old man said, yeah, it was good. And I enjoyed it, but, I don't bother so much with forgiveness. And the minister said, why? It's essential for Christianity. What is your approach then? He said, my approach is simply to outlive the scoundrels. That is one approach to forgiveness. The other one that was interesting that was offered by Oscar Wilde, that said, always forgive your enemies. There is nothing that bothers them so much. So we find here an adherence to the letter of the law, like with Oscar Wilde, of forgiveness. But the intent is the opposite. The intent is to rile them, to upset them, to bother them. And I think in that process, you destroy what forgiveness is supposed to be about. We found in this passage that we listened to something about adhering to the letter of the law, but not taking the content or the intent and the relational aspect of it into account. The truth that the letter of the law is one thing, but if it is not based on and reflective of the intent and the emotional, relational aspects around it, and if it is not true and does not have integrity in that sense, then you are actually destroying what you claim to do according to the letter of the law. What we read here is part of the sayings of Jesus that is also known as the antithesis or antitheses. 6 sayings where Jesus says, you have heard, and then he says the strict Jewish law, and then he says, but I tell you. So 6 times repeatedly as part of the collection of sayings that we have come to know as the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus addresses something, a core element in the Jewish law. And I think the best way to read it is not to say that Jesus was criticizing the Jewish law. I tried to find something about this in Jewish literature to see how rabbis and Jewish teachers would interpret and understand this. And it seems to me that, and this is my uninformed interpretation of Jewish scholarship, that a better understanding is to say, you may think that this law, for instance, in this passage, only applies to murder, but there's a huge field or a domain, a lot of other stuff covered by this. It is, in the end, about the intent, and it is about the purpose, and it is about the relational aspects of it as well. So it's not that Jesus say, if you don't kill, you are obeying the law not to murder. We are familiar with the passage that if it is in your heart to harm other people, that same law applies. In one of these antitheses, Jesus also addresses forgiveness. And we know that he says, forgive 70 times 70. I think forgiveness compared to reconciliation is actually the easy part. Because forgiveness is a unilateral action. It is a decision an individual or a group of people make to let go of something. As I've said, it's a unilateral action. You decide to forgive. You decide to let go. And in the process, you liberate yourself. Because for as long as you do not forgive an action that you perceive or that you experience as being hurtful or wrong against you, that action by the other holds you captive and holds you prison. And your life is determined by what somebody else did. It took me practically the whole part of my life up till now to realize that. I've read it before, but it wasn't lived experience. I couldn't get myself to that simple wisdom, and it is indeed profound wisdom, and my life has become much easier since I've started to accept that wisdom and to make that unilateral decision that no matter what the other party thinks or does, whether they are interested in hearing that I forgive them, whether they are interested in reconciliation as a next step, whatever they think and do, I have the freedom and the power to make that decision to set myself free from what was hurtful and what was damaging to me, and to live as a free person, free from the bonds of the past, free from the pain of the past. That does not mean that you are going to set yourself up to be punished and hurt in the same way. I think it is also a responsible Christian attitude to learn and not to repeat the mistakes of the past. If we look at reconciliation, I think forgiveness can be an important first step so that you can enter into the process of reconciliation, of mending relationships, of putting what was wrong out there, of talking about it, and then do what is necessary so that both parties that have committed to reconciliation and to the process can really say, after we've walked this road, the relationship has been restored. It is not an easy process, as many have found out, individuals and nations. But if we listen to the passage and the words of Jesus here, we see how important truth is in the process and integrity of your words and your actions. Jesus used the illustration of integrity between your religious conduct and your life. He said, when you go to the temple to bring an offering, which is the action of bringing something to restore the relationship between you and God, a reconciliatory part of the process, to have a good and a restored relationship between you and God. And on your way there to be restored with God, you remember somebody has something against you that is harmful to your relationship. Your religious conviction and your Christian conduct should urge you to turn to what is wrong in that relationship, whether it's your fault or not. It is that important. It is that important, so important, that it should lead you to do that continuously. As Martin Luther King said, and I want to read two quotations from him. He places reconciliation at the heart of Christianity and at the heart and instrumental to becoming and being the beloved community. What did Martin Luther King say about this? Resistance and nonviolence are not in themselves good. There is another element that must be present in our struggle that then makes our resistance and nonviolence truly meaningful. That element is reconciliation. Our ultimate end must be the creation of the beloved community. He continues, the end of violence or the aftermath of violence is bitterness. The aftermath of nonviolence is reconciliation and the creation of a beloved community. A boycott is never an end within itself. It is merely a means to awaken a sense of shame within the oppressor. But the end is reconciliation. The end is redemption. I also speak to you today as a South African that lived at least through part of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and the hearings that were conducted after the new South Africa dawned on that country. I thought that that was a rather unique process that we went through. And I did some reading again last night on that as well. And it's interesting that there were about 50 such commissions, Truth and Reconciliation Commissions, and processes across the globe and within the history of different nations. In the US, we even had 2 of those. And is anybody aware of those, where such processes were implemented? There were 2. The one was, and they both fairly recently. The one was in the 90s. That was in the state of Maine, where the commission dealing with Truth and Reconciliation tried to address the past wrongs against the Abenaki nations. And I haven't read much about it. I just discovered it. I will still want to try and look into that. And the other one was interesting enough in North Carolina, the Greensboro violence events where in, I think it was 93, several people were killed in Greensboro, and the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was set up to specifically look at that. I found that interesting. I'm wondering to what extent the current conversation about reparations and ongoing conversation and perhaps lack of conversation about the First Peoples or the Native Americans and also slavery, where this will lead in this nation. Because speaking as a South African from experience, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission is fraught with difficulties. It is extremely painful, both sides. And the truth, critical as it is often perceived by people on different sides as being something totally different. It is a highly emotional, exhausting, psychologically harrowing process that goes to the core of those involved. And if a nation is involved in that, goes to the core of the identity of that nation. There is sufficient illustration from what we've read. And the emphasis is Jesus on the truth between conduct and what you profess, and the truth and the integrity of the process where reconciliation is involved. Apart from the practical advice that Jesus gives, which is still true today, there he says, don't be angry when you go into a reconciliation process. You cannot think clearly. You will mess it up. Other good advice is simple legal advice. Settle before you get to court. Because the process has the tendency to escalate. He speaks about the local Jewish courts being set up. And it's better to settle while you're on your way there. Those courts, according to Deuteronomy 16, verse 18. It's better to settle while you're on your way to that local court. Otherwise, it will be escalated and kicked up to the Sanhedrin if you can't settle, which was the highest Jewish court, the Jewish council, 70 members that sat in Jerusalem. Jesus giving that advice. But let us remember what Jesus said about the truth and the integrity of that process. And how Martin Luther King took that and made that the essence and the purpose, the end purpose of being a beloved community and becoming a beloved community. That it is incumbent on us to have the courage, apart from forgiveness, which I still think is the easier part of it, to be willing, because we are Christians, to make that our hallmark and part of our core identity to work towards reconciliation as individuals, in our relationships. Relevant in our situation as church in the community. And we had a meeting with the abutters or a delegation from the abutters on Tuesday evening again. A few of us, and it was intense conversation. But in the end, I think from our side, the agreed purpose was also that we should work towards reconciliation, while not neglecting the responsibility we have towards our membership, especially our fiduciary responsibility to make the best use of our assets. Let us be God's people, a community of reconciliation. And let us assume that responsibility with a good heart. Because if God's Spirit is really in us, as we profess, we cannot shy away from that responsibility. We should assume that task with open eyes, but with consistency, with great commitment. So that the beloved community can come into being, so that justice may prevail, so that peace may result from that. Let us together engage that task, and let us respond to the urging of the Spirit to walk in the way that we have to follow if there is integrity between our conduct and what we profess. Amen.